This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Tracking announcements and proclamations coming from U.S. President-elect Donald Trump can be a challenge, to say the least, especially when it comes to foreign relations and trade recently. With Trump threatening tariffs or worse on countries across the world, even close allies of the U.S., it's a strange time to try and figure out what may come next. While Vietnam isn't a U.S. ally, the two countries enjoy ties that have never been better. A few months ago, the pair celebrated the first anniversary of their comprehensive strategic partnership, a development that put the U.S. on the same diplomatic level as China and Russia, longtime partners at least of Vietnam. Economically, and especially in terms of trade, the two have never been closer, though much of this goes in one direction. The U.S. is Vietnam's largest export market, with exports worth almost $120 billion last year, while Vietnam only imported about $12 billion or so in goods from the U.S. That's enough to give Vietnam the third largest trade surplus with the U.S. after China and Mexico, two countries squarely in the bullseye of Trump's current tariff rhetoric. But what could this mean for Vietnam, which has largely avoided Trump's verbal wrath, so far at least? Today's guest is Kyle Freeman, a partner at Desan Shira and Associates, who leads the International Business Advisory Team, as well as the firm's North American Client Services desk in Asia. We discussed the latest tariff threats coming from President-elect Trump, how Vietnam benefited from U.S. trade policy during his first administration, Vietnam's exposure to potential trade remedies given its huge surplus just mentioned, and growing Chinese manufacturing investment, among other issues, how export-focused companies are preparing for another Trump presidency, and more. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarsky@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Kyle. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Obviously, we're talking about the incoming Trump presidency and trade policy and things like that. And anytime it comes to this, I mean, I work with the caveat that all of this is very unpredictable, as we've seen in recent days. So we're recording this on the 9th for context, but it seems like every day there's a new pronouncement. Obviously, a lot of discussion about Greenland and Canada and Panama, but we're going to try to focus on Vietnam as rationally as we can. So I guess we'll start, again, there's been a lot of discussion and announcements coming from Mar-a-Lago, but what's kind of the latest on tariffs, the tariff rhetoric coming from the incoming Trump administration?
Yeah, tariffs, or what Trump has called the most beautiful word in the dictionary. So obviously we don't have any Trump 2.0 tariffs yet because Trump has not taken office yet.
Mm-hmm.
And as you noted, trying to guess what Trump's policies will be is somewhat dangerous, as I think he's deliberately unpredictable when it comes to trade policy. But we can look at what he said. So on the campaign trail, he more or less threatened the whole world with tariffs and proposed some, I would say, novel types of tariffs. So the first would be blanket tariffs. These would be in the form of a 10 to 20% tariff on all imports to the U.S. The second one was reciprocal tariffs. So basically, if a country has tariffs on certain goods or U.S. goods going into that country, the U.S. will apply tariffs on these goods coming into the U.S. from that country. So not sure if this is just campaign rhetoric, as he hasn't discussed it too much since the election. Since being elected, he's focused more on what I would consider country-based tariffs. So he's proposed a 60% tariff on goods coming from China. My understanding is that would be an additional 60% on top of the tariffs he's already imposed, and in the Biden administration as well, on most goods from China. Then there's Canada and Mexico. So he's proposed a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico. Here I would note the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. So that was previously NAFTA and renegotiated under Trump's first term, referring to this as the USMCA. So the USMCA has come into effect under Trump's first term, but it has to be renegotiated in 2026. So these tariffs or threats of tariffs could be used as leverage there. Trump also mentioned possible tariffs, and you alluded to this, Mike, on Canada and Denmark to apply economic pressure so that Canada and Greenland become part of the US, suggesting one or both become the 51st state. Notably, Greenland is a territory of Denmark, so the tariff would be on Denmark. I'm not sure how serious this is, but given Trump's background in real estate, potentially we shouldn't be surprised he's trying to make a real estate deal at the country level. So definitely a lot of potential tariffs being discussed, but yeah, as you mentioned, I think we'll just have to wait and see how this works out.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll get to how some of this may impact Vietnam in a little bit. But I wondered if we could go back a few years, well, I suppose about 8 years or so, to kind of briefly look at, I mean, tariffs are not new for Trump. Obviously, his first administration, this was a big issue as well, particularly regarding China. Could you kind of briefly go into what his policy was in his first term and also how this impacted Vietnam?
Trade policy in his first term was described as kind of a America first trade policy. I think a more accurate description of his trade policy during that time would be maybe managed trade, where the administration used various trade policy tools as leverage to negotiate specific trade deals, mainly bilateral deals or targeted outcomes. So, for example, I would say the administration's trade policy towards China has some parallels between the trade policy towards Japan in the 80s. Um, Notably, Lighthizer was the deputy U.S. trade representative, USTR, for part of the 80s and was Trump's USTR during the first administration. But as your question alluded to, the trade tool that got the most attention in his first term was tariffs. There were a lot of tariffs on specific goods like steel, aluminum, solar panels, and even washing machines. Some of these have been rolled back and some are still in place. However, the big one was the Section 301 tariffs on U.S. imports from China. So, 301 tariffs are meant to combat unfair trade practices, in this case, unfair trade practices by China. These tariffs were rolled out in a few tranches, but ultimately ended up placing tariffs on most goods from China. The Biden administration has continued with these tariffs and even increased some of the tariffs on certain products. So the Section 301 tariffs kind of kicked off the US China trade war and kind of some of the supply chain diversification that we've seen from since that time. So for Vietnam, Vietnam has obviously been one of the big beneficiaries from all of this supply chain diversification. So if we start in 2018, when the 301 tariff started, the US was Vietnam's largest export market, but Vietnam's exports to China at that time were about the same size. So fast forwarding to now, Vietnam's exports to the US have more than doubled.
Hmm.
So using the 2024 numbers just from last year, I think they've grown by about 150% since 2018. Vietnam's exports to the US are now more than twice the size of its exports to its second largest market, which is China. We don't see this type of export growth for any of Vietnam's other major export
Hmm.
markets. So those other major export markets would be China, the EU, ASEAN, Japan, and I think Korea as well. So for all of those markets, looking back to 2018 till now, um, exports to each of those markets grew no more than 40%. So Vietnam's exports to the US grew 3 to 4 times faster than any of these other markets. Also, if we look at Vietnam's exports as a share of the US's total imports, so what percentage of goods imported to the US were from Vietnam, this grew by about 2%. So 2% of the total imports in the US market, or Vietnam goods gained a 2% market share. So 2% might seem small, but is pretty significant in this context. The only other country to increase its market share of US imports more during this period was Mexico. There were other countries that gained, obviously, but all of these were typically 1% or less. So these would include Taiwan, Korea, India, and I think Thailand as well. So during that period, we also see that Chinese goods as a share of total U.S. imports decreased. I think they decreased by about 8%. So we can see that this decrease in Chinese goods going into the U.S. was replaced by goods coming from other locations or other countries, and Vietnam was one of the main sources. And if we look at what goods Vietnam was sending to the US and which ones gained the most, it would predominantly be electronics. So electronics increased its market share there by about 1%, and also machinery. So machinery increased the market share by about 0.5%.
Yeah, I mean, it's of course well documented at this point how Vietnam's export economy, especially to the U.S., has grown since the start of the trade war between the U.S. and China. And I mean, at the same time, there's kind of been this concurrent trend of rising FDI into Vietnam from China. I mean, for a while, the narrative was it's like mostly Western or Northeast Asian companies moving out of China into Vietnam, for China plus one or de-risking, whatever term you want to use. But it's become increasingly clear that a lot of this is also Chinese companies expanding into Vietnam. And this is raising some concerns about transshipment, I guess, in talks about, trade policies from the U.S. Could you just briefly explain what transshipment is and then kind of what are the concerns around that?
Sure. So the transshipment would basically be goods being produced in China and just routed through another country and then onto the US. Um, there's probably some transshipment happening, but to what degree is more difficult to say. So I mentioned the increase in Vietnam's exports to the US. We haven't seen US investment or FDI into Vietnam increase at the same pace during this period. So the US is only Vietnam's, I think, 10th largest source of FDI, and that doesn't grow or change too much year to year. Some of this could be that US companies use other investment structures like outsourced manufacturing, partnerships, franchising, or even holding companies in other countries like in Singapore. All of that wouldn't show up in FDI data. But at the same time, Chinese foreign investment in Vietnam has grown quite a bit. So China grew to become Vietnam's largest investor in 2022 and 2023. Last year, I think it was Vietnam's third largest investor. So that's based on value of FDI. But Vietnam had the most FDI projects in Vietnam. So more projects just at a lower value than investors from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean there's transshipment happening? Well, there are definitely a lot of Chinese companies coming here to Vietnam, setting up substantial operations for manufacturing or assembly. Some of the input goods or components do still come from China, but a lot of Western companies that have set up similar operations in Vietnam still get components from China. I think a lot of the Chinese companies that manufacture or assemble in Vietnam add enough value in Vietnam that it's not technically considered a transshipment, and they just shifted their supply chains, as many Western companies from Western countries have done.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of looking at FDI, we could also look at the increase in Vietnam's imports from China. That probably gives a better picture, but still not the whole picture.
Right.
That might be a little wonky for us to go into today, um, as you have to kind of match product categories and other things. But I think the big takeaway here is that China is still very much involved in
Mm.
the supply chain for goods going to the US, either at the component parts level or via Chinese companies manufacturing and assembling in Vietnam and then exporting to the US. Does all this constitute transshipment? It depends on what the goals are and how strictly you want to define transshipment. I could probably give an example to color that a little bit more if you want.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So a good example, I think, would be the U.S. tariffs on solar panels from Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. So the Obama administration originally put tariffs on solar panels from China to the U.S. in 2012. At that time, Chinese solar panels accounted for about half of all solar panels being imported into the U.S. And then after Trump put additional tariffs as part of the Section 301 tariffs, I believe, on Chinese solar panels as well. I think that was in 2018. So since then, many of the big Chinese solar companies have moved factories to Southeast Asia. And many of those Chinese solar companies had factories in northern Vietnam, with almost all of them being established since 2018.
Okay.
So now about 75% of US solar panel imports come from Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And almost no imports come from China. That's kind of broad strokes. The technicalities of those tariffs are a little bit more nuanced. But what's happened here is technically not transshipment, but it is circumventing tariffs to some degree. And some have broadly
Hmm.
referred to this as transshipment. So I think in the context of transshipment, there's kind of, in the general discussion of that, there's a broad application of that term that might not apply to the technical application of that term.
Okay. And then in terms of there's kind of two other issues for Vietnam that could potentially put a target on the country for tariffs that we should unpack. I mean, I will note that Trump has not singled out Vietnam in any of his recent rhetoric. I mean, even pre-election, I never really saw it discussed in any meaningful way. But the trade surplus that Vietnam has with the U.S. Gets a lot of discussion, and it just came out within I think this week that the trade deficit grew by about 20% in the first 11 months of last year over the same period in 2023, reaching I think almost 110 billion dollars. And Trump, for years, has certainly talked a lot about how he hates the U.S. having trade deficits. This certainly is an issue for Vietnam. This is the third largest trade deficit. Or sorry, they have the third largest surplus with the U.S. after China and Mexico. What do you make of that issue?
Yeah, so certainly Vietnam's imports from the US have not grown at the same pace exports to the US have grown. As you mentioned, the US's third largest trade deficit is with Vietnam, and the only larger trade deficits the US has are with China and Mexico, um, which Trump has already proposed new or additional tariffs against. So there's some potential political liability in having this
Mm,
such a large trade deficit. You also mentioned Trump tends to talk about trade deficits quite a bit. So I think this is an area to watch. Um, Tariffs wouldn't directly be introduced on the grounds of a trade deficit, but the trade deficit would provide potential political motivation to introduce tariffs on other grounds, like Section 301 tariff or another form. So I think there's a political liability there. Another area I would watch is somewhat related to the trade deficit, but would be currency manipulation.
hmm
So that at the end of Trump's first term, USTR initiated, the U.S. Trade Representative's office initiated a Section 301 investigation relating to Vietnam's currency practices. The Treasury Department also labeled Vietnam as a currency manipulator. Those issues were resolved through negotiations under the Biden administration, but the Treasury Department does release a semi-annual report on currency manipulation. And the most recent report was just this past November, where Vietnam was not labeled as a currency manipulator, but was placed on the watch list.
mm.
Vietnam wasn't the only country on the watch list. I think others included China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and I believe Germany was on that list as well. So I think probably the Treasury Department's determination on whether Vietnam is a currency manipulator is something to watch. The next report, and the first one that would come out under the new Trump administration, will likely be sometime in March or April. Um,
Okay.
so again, something to watch there. Just to unpack currency manipulation real quick, there's three criteria that the Treasury Department would use to assess currency manipulation. So one is having a large trade surplus with the U.S. Uh, we've already mentioned Vietnam has that. Two is a large current account surplus, which Vietnam has. It's about 3 to 5% of GDP. And the last one is a history of currency intervention, which Vietnam doesn't necessarily have. So Vietnam already meets two of these three criteria, and that's why it's on the watch list currently.
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly things to keep an eye out for. And now, kind of shifting into what you've been seeing and hearing on the ground as the new Trump administration approaches. What are you hearing from your clients in terms of both concerns about potential tariffs and then hopes or optimism about what this trade positions can mean for Vietnam?
Yeah. So as far as the approach that companies are taking, um, so the supply chain diversification that's happening because of U.S. policies towards China, generally companies are continuing to pursue the strategies that they've already been pursuing in that area, as I don't think there's much optimism that U.S.-China relations will begin to trend in a positive direction. So that includes kind of supply chain diversification, but also kind of ring fencing some of their China operations. So they're not necessarily leaving China completely, but they're restructuring those operations and moving part of them to other jurisdictions, and a lot of them moving into Vietnam. As far as kind of making decisions around what might happen in Trump 2.0, as we discussed, there's still a lot of uncertainty. So I think companies are taking somewhat of a wait and see approach before making m- any any next moves there.
Yeah, that definitely seems fair. Especially again, given the uncertainty. And I mean, speaking of uncertainty, that doesn't make it easy for governments to plan policy responses either. But what have you kind of seen from the Vietnamese government in terms of their approach to concerns about tariffs or just the possibility overall?
Yeah, again, there haven't necessarily been any new policies directly addressing maybe concerns that might arise from a second Trump administration. Mainly what we're seeing is Vietnam continuing to roll out policies that would be conducive for investment in Vietnam. So we have some incentives that were just introduced recently for certain industries, and I think one of the other big ones is obvi- obviously infrastructure, including roads, ports, and also power supply and clean energy. So not really addressing any of maybe the concerns that we've already talked about, but really just making Vietnam a more attractive place to invest and do business in hopes of capitalizing on some of these supply chain restructuring shifts.
And then again, I know we can't predict anything that's going to happen, but what's kind of your take? I mean, I've seen a wide range of opinions from ranging from people saying Vietnam really needs to be worried about this, given some of what we've already discussed, to others saying this won't be a big deal for Vietnam. If there's blanket tariffs globally, it won't really impact their competitiveness because everyone would have the same level of tariff. Well, I guess except for China and some other countries. To think opinions in between those two. What's your thinking at the moment?
Yeah, maybe first I can touch on the blanket tariffs, and then come back to maybe
Hmm.
what an ideal situation might be for Vietnam. So for the blanket tariffs, just taking the question at face value, assuming this is just blanket tariffs, so there's no retaliatory policies from other countries. As I think in the case of blanket tariffs, there would be a lot of secondary considerations, such as retaliatory tariffs from other countries or other issues. Um, if it's just the blanket tariffs, I would guess in the near term, that would not negatively affect Vietnam too much. I mean, the US doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to reshore all the manufacturing that's done overseas. So the US would still need to import a lot of what it already imports. If we're talking about, a 10 to 20% tariff on all imports, cost of all imports from all countries would go up the same. So all things being equal, I think Vietnam would retain its comparative advantage, at least in the near term. In the medium term or long term, it'd be a little bit more difficult to say. But this is interesting because there have been some reports in the last few days that suggest if the administration moves forward with a blanket tariff, it would be scaled down a little bit and would instead only be enacted on or for a few critical industries. Trump responded to this and said this was fake news, so I think we'll have to wait and see. But if he does want to do that, I think it would have to be maybe through executive action or some type. I don't know that he has the support in Congress to do that. The Republicans have a thin majority in Congress, and given that something like that would be highly disruptive, I'm not sure he would have the congressional support there. Just to unpack that, trade policy is under the purview of Congress. The president has certain emergency powers to enact tariffs. So in his first administration, he used these powers for Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs on the grounds of national security, and Section 301 tariffs on goods from China on the grounds of discriminatory trade practices. For a blanket tariff, I'm not sure he could claim that there was a national security concern for relating to all goods in all countries. And I'm not sure he could claim that all countries had discriminatory trade practices. So what he might do here is something that wasn't used in his first term, but he could use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That law would give him pretty broad authority to act, but he would have to declare basically kind of a national economic emergency to do so. So it would be interesting to see how he would do a blanket tariff. Um, as far as an ideal circumstance for Vietnam, um, obviously, it would be no new tariffs on goods from Vietnam or on Vietnam in general, and potentially seeing tariffs on countries that Vietnam competes with for exports to the U.S. So it's interesting that Trump has brought up potential tariffs for Mexico. I mentioned Vietnam was one of the big winners as far as the supply chain restructuring, uh, but Mexico was also one of the big winners. So if we look at w- the import share gained for total U.S. imports, I mentioned Vietnam grew quite a bit there, about 2%. The only country that grew more during that period was Mexico. So Mexico grew just over 2%. So if tariffs were placed on goods from Mexico, that would potentially benefit uh, Vietnam as well. The goods being sent from Mexico to the U.S. are not exactly the same as those from Vietnam. So I mentioned a lot of electronics and machinery. Uh, were coming from Vietnam to the US. Mexico, it's a little bit more diverse. There's electronics and machinery, but also a large number of vehicles and other types of goods. And then I think the last area that would potentially benefit Vietnam, and Trump has proposed this, would be uh, additional tariffs on China, which would continue to kind of push this supply chain restructuring that we've seen.
Yeah, well, it's a lot to keep an eye on. I mean, for all we know, we could wake up tomorrow and some announcement will have made much of what we've just discussed redundant. Hopefully not. But anyway, Kyle, thanks so much for taking some time to discuss these issues. I know it's tricky when so much is still up in the air, and we've got a couple weeks before, or I guess about a week and a half until Trump is even in office. But still good to get a grasp of things before that. So I appreciate you coming on, and thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think there will be quite a bit to keep an eye out for, to watch, and yeah, happy to potentially come back again and see how this has progressed.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's make that happen. That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and see you next time.